is.
All right, are we on? Did you hear that music? Woof. Well, good afternoon to all of you, and what an exciting conference. As you heard from Governor Baker, who I have to say thank you not only for your leadership here in Massachusetts for so much that has been accomplished, but also to really remind us that AI is about making sure that we use it as a tool to do important things for those that are actually treating, diagnosing, and the patients that are actually receiving the care. So this panel today, hopefully we're going to spend some time talking a bit more about where is AI today? Is it really here? How should we think about it from bedside all the way to the bench? So as we go through this, first and foremost, what I'm going to do is do a quick introduction because most of you already know who they are. Do we have names already up?
There's some right there.
Here, no, I didn't know if they were going to be on the screen. So let me start with Keith to my left, Keith Dreyer, and this is going to be literally position, rank, and then a quick tidbit so that you guys know who they really are. Oh. So, okay, Keith Dreyer is Chief Data Science Officer for Partners Healthcare. He's also Vice Chairman of Radiology at MGH, and he's Associate Professor of Radiology at Harvard Medical School. Impressive as all that is, Keith's first job ever was writing video games for Atari when he was in high school. Now, were you involved in Pong?
I played Pong.
You played Pong. Now, how many of you guys played Pong? Raise your hand. You guys know what it is, right? It tells you this is an aged crowd.
That was my
so much for the millennials. They don't even know what Pong is.
That was my first AI experience.
Oh, there you go.
I never won.
All right. Sitting to our left, and you've already had a chance to hear from Ann today, of course, is Ann Klibanski. She is, of course, the forum co-chair for us. And as Chief Academic Officer here at Partners Healthcare, one of the things that Ann wanted to share with us is that her favorite sport, and I suspect many of you will not guess this at all regarding Ann, and that is fencing. She shared that these skills have proven to be valuable not only in academics, but also for her overall career. How does it go?
That is true.
Touche? Yeah? All right. And then Callum Mcmurray, he is Vice Chair for Scientific Innovation, the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He's Chief Executive Officer of One Brave Idea. And what he chose to actually share with us is that, and I had to actually chuckle when I saw this, he says that he plays the bagpipes, his last name, right, MacRae, and as a testament that he's actually a true gentleman, he doesn't. I had to laugh. Next to him is Gregg Meyer. He's Chief Clinical Officer at Partners Healthcare, and he's Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. He's also Ann's partner in crime this year, as you heard, as the other forum co-chair. And what Gregg revealed to us is that he actually loves playing ice hockey, so much so that his obsession obligates him to build an ice rink in his backyard every winter.
Yes.
Can you believe that? And he says that late night snapshots are absolutely a great stress relief. And then last but certainly not the least is Tony Rosenzweig. He's Chief of Cardiology and Division and Co-Director of the Corrigan-Meinhardt Center at MGH. He was the 2017 Forum Co-Chair with Calum and last year. And something you won't find on Google about him is that he does most of his email and other computer tasks on a treadmill, as you can see by his svelte figure. And he says that if his responses are ever incoherent, all you have to say is, please turn down the speed. So there you go. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of these experts that are going to give us a little bit of a view all around AI. And, you know, all of us know, and we've already heard, these are game-changing technologies here. Gene therapy is game-changing. You hear a tremendous amount with regards to the cloud. AI, there is nothing more present right now than AI in every single industry. So the question is, are we finally here in healthcare? Is it actually doing what we think it's supposed to do? And if you guys, and it's going to be the whole panel, if you can just give a little bit of some examples of where you think it's present, that would be really helpful. So I'm going to just pick randomly. And Gregg, we'll start with you.
Great. So, you know, when I think about where AI is right now, one of the things I think is different than maybe some of the discussions that we've had about genomics and others that have come maybe slower to our basic clinical workflow every day than people had originally hoped, is AI is around us everywhere. We're used to dealing with AI whether or not we're buying something on Amazon or we're trying to interact with getting a ride to the airport. But what we haven't yet seen is it really getting integrated into clinical workflow where we're seeing patients every day. But we're starting to see it. Right? We are starting to see it. And so some of it is showing up as very sophisticated decision support. To me, as a primary care physician, it just looks like, hey, this is probably the right thing to do and you ought to choose it. But behind that, there's a great deal of AI. So I think things are starting to seep in.
So you're seeing it embedded essentially in the workflows, which is really key, and we're going to hear that as a constant theme, I suspect, throughout the conference. Anne, how about you?
I would just comment in terms of research. One thing is the transition or trying to distinguish machine learning and algorithms from AI. And a lot of times these terms are used interchangeably, but they're not really the same thing depending on who you are and what you're looking at and where you're going. So for research and also in the clinical world, there have been some striking developments in algorithms that enable us to look at data, to do incredible, it's curated data, it's the algorithms, it's the query tools that have really been enabled us to get certain populations, look at population phenotypes, pull together a lot of different types of data for research and also for clinical purposes. But what I'm still looking for is that full integration of all of the data streams that will enable the real kind of predictive modeling, the type of diagnosis, what will really propel these fields forward. Because right now we're seeing it, but it's, I would say, still very segmented, and how that will all come together. And that's not just from our own academic point of view, but come together in terms of all of these partnerships that are developing in all these disciplines to actually move things forward in a big way.
Coming together all the data, Keith. This is part of your role, right? Making this all happen. Tell us a little bit. Where do you think it is?
Well, I think, you know, AI deployment and success of AI gets a little bit of a bum rap, and that's because there's a lot of narrow solutions that are coming into play first. So if you think about in consumer space, if you pull out your smartphone and you search for an object inside your pictures, 4 years ago you couldn't do that unless you tagged it. Now you can. You can search for thousands of different features. But how many of you know that that's artificial intelligence that's doing that? It's really just a smarter phone. So when you look at these narrow applications and AI works, people don't call it AI anymore. And then when you try and, as Anne and Gregg said, when you try a more comprehensive solution, I would say think back to 20 years ago on the internet when you looked for, I remember searching for a faucet that would fit in my sink, and I had to go to a faucet website. And now you just go to the internet and it finds it all for you. To get to that point of like complete ubiquity is going to take a long time in healthcare. So if you think the end goal is that ubiquitous state, we're nowhere near that. But if you think that getting solutions in that actually work and solve a particular problem, we're clearly there every day.
So pick the problem is how we're approaching it.
Right.
Callum?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's been said so far. I think one of the things that we've finally done is reach the point where the compute is not rate limiting. And the infrastructure that we use to collect the data and the type of data and the workflows end up being the rate limiting steps. And so I think, as Keith said, there are some really great early solutions that are coming forward, but the fully integrated solution is something that's going to take a real redevelopment of the entire infrastructure that we use to collect data and the type of data that we collect.
Wow. Tony?
So I certainly agree with what's been said. I think the other metric that I use is a very small data metric based on the number of people who come into my office and tell me that big data, AI, and machine learning are going to solve all of our problems. And that outnumbers sort of 10 to 1 the people who say, wait a minute. So I think we're still early in the evolution, very exciting, narrow applications that are kind of the low-hanging fruit. But moving toward those broader applications, thinking about how to really apply it is going to take more work, obviously.
So I'm going to stay right there and just ask you. So, you know, everybody says, well, AI is going to fix a lot of things. And we all believe that to a certain extent it will, like you've described. But will AI really make patients healthier? Tony?
Well, I think it's obviously up to us how we use it. It's a tool. It can be enormously powerful. It also potentially has pitfalls that we have to be aware of. So ultimately, it's going to depend on healthcare providers, engineers, working together as teams to figure out how to use it best to improve patient care on a population and individual basis.
Yep, Anne?
So the issue still is always the same, and that is that patients are people, providers are people, people are people. And what I mean by that is we live in a very technologically advanced country, but people are not getting healthier at all. In fact, they're getting less healthy. So part of the challenge is that you have to, in some way, and this is really tough, implement the technology in a way that is meaningful and that is acceptable. So I'm an endocrinologist. If I look at the care of patients with diabetes, there are incredible technologies that are available now to monitor glucoses and treat patients with diabetes. And yet more and more people are getting diabetes. Control is very difficult. Why? Because people can track things and not act on them. And physicians can track things and want to act on them, but can't act on them for a variety of reasons. So it's very complicated. So I'd say the implementation is what's tricky, and you can't equate knowledge, AI, and technological advances with health. They can get you there. They'll bring you to the right direction, but they won't get you over the finish line.
Agreed.
Yeah. I'm incredibly excited about some of the, the positive benefits here and things like being able to get away from the trial and error, which really is much in the way that we approach a lot of diseases, be it depression or hypertension. We try something, we see if it works, and then if it's not working so well, we try something else. And I think when we really mine our data and apply artificial intelligence to it, we're going to get away from that. And so I see that as enormously positive. I do think in many ways it's going to make patients healthier, but it's also going to make patients more nervous. And those of us on the stage here, we're all of a certain vintage. And when we went to medical
Speak
school,
for yourself.
we learned about something called le mal de petit papier. And le mal de petit papier basically said if a patient came into your office and they had all of their health concerns on a little piece of paper, that said something about them. Well, I'm happy to report that le mal de petit papier, like smallpox, has been eradicated from the face of the earth. Because during the 1990s and noughts, it was replaced by le mal de internet printout. And I have no doubt that we are going to go through a phase where we are going to have le mal de downloaded Fitbit AI massage data that patients want us to react to, and we need to kind of get through that phase with them together.
Can I just ask, what do you do when patients come in and present that kind of, what's your typical answer? Just share it with everyone.
Yeah, so I would say, the first thing I do is I think with all humility, I often will tell them, you know something? I'm not sure what this means either. Maybe we're going to figure it out together.
Yeah.
And I think that
Good
that's
answer.
often the case.
Very good answer. All right, on that note, Keith, I'm coming to you with this one, and this is, what's really going to limit the adoption of AI in healthcare? We talked about workflow and infrastructure. Give us a little, you're very close to this, and you're building up that infrastructure, in fact, for the system here.
So let me break it into two components. The first one is, what happens if you want to make artificial intelligence? Because it's almost like this is going to be a straightforward way for people to interact and work with your own data. If all goes well, and I think we'll be talking to Jensen Wang tomorrow about what NVIDIA is doing to make these kind of things happen in a broad scale way. So from that side, what does it take? To make this, as was mentioned, the data just is not exact enough today. So the first thing you do is look at your data and you realize you need to structure and organize your data.
Right.
Somehow humans just deal with that chaos, but computer systems do not. So that's step one. And then to be able to implement this, it's almost the same thing again. You have to have structured, organized systems and data to be able to make that interaction occur. I always use the analogy, if you had an autonomous vehicle piece of software, but it sat on a smartphone, and you were driving a 55 Chevy with it, you wouldn't ever get anywhere. But if it was built into a dashboard of a smart computer system inside of a car, now you can actually start to use it. We're just not that advanced when it comes to the technology that the AI needs to sit on. So adoption, aside from humans have to learn this, humans have to interact with, you have to interact with your patients, we're asking a lot of the systems that we have today to adopt this new technology that's evolving as we speak.
But aren't you glad the conversation has just shifted from terrible EMRs to now AI? You must be. right?
I think the challenge too, though, is that, will AI fix the terrible EMRs? And that's, again, asking a lot, right? But I think there will be a resurgence or a redefinition of what that user interface means, what it needs, to the point of what Gregg said. When patients come in with this information, they may already have it to themselves. They may want to get an analysis before they show up at the physician's office. So what does that interface look like?
Yeah. Calum?
I would certainly second everything Keith has said. I think part of one of the earliest barriers, but also one of the earliest advantages, I think, of AI is that it will help to break down the lack of systemness that exists in healthcare. So I do believe that the silos that we currently practice in will be one of the most difficult things to overcome. And as part of reworking the core infrastructure, rethinking the data sets that we actually collect, and even imagining for the first time where the information lies and how it can best be deployed around the patient rather than around our existing infrastructure, will themselves actually end up having a major effect. I do think that vested interests will have a major role to play in slowing the implementation of AI. That may not be a bad thing, because I think we do need to get the balance right. But I believe that ultimately, as Keith said, re-engineering the entire system is going to be one of the very earliest benefits that are an obvious inference from the use of AI.
And that isn't technology. That is overwhelming people. Any comments, Tony?
So I think collecting the data, but making sure that it's in a format that is can speak to each other across platforms, can be accessible through programming interfaces, will be important at the outset. Otherwise, we're going to wind up with multiple competing platforms and segmented, siloed data that we don't get as much information as we should out of.
Yeah. Just even in some of the comments, there's lots of noise about medical professionals being completely supplanted by AI, automation, robotics, clinical decision support systems, et cetera, and just healthcare professionals disappearing. What's the first healthcare discipline, do you think, that's going to actually disappear?
I would say,
You're not raising your hand.
speaking broadly, and not about clinicians in particular, I think that there are a lot of functions that we already have seen change dramatically. I think about the world of health information management, right? Yep. Where we used to all have medical record techs. We used to have people who worked in files, file rooms that helped us retrieve x-rays. They've all gone. And so this notion that there's going to be all of a sudden this incredible breakdown in what we've known because these jobs are going to disappear overnight. No, we've kind of managed that transition in other parts of the healthcare system. We're going to manage that with clinicians too. I'm not sure which one's going to be, quote, the first to disappear. Here's what I will predict. All of us will change. Mm-hmm. All of us will change in some way or another. What we do every day, when we interact with patients, when we do our research, when we teach our students, we will change.
Mm-hmm. That's great. What would you counsel if you have a medical student coming in now? Which area would you counsel them to go into based on that answer? By the way, this wasn't prepped at all, so this is kind of testing.
Well, I'll take that. So about a year and a half ago, one of the data science pundits, one of the founders of the field from years ago, came in a group that probably didn't realize YouTube was on, and they said, we might as well stop training radiologists right now. I mean, it's completely obvious that within 5 to 10 years that AI will beat all radiologists. Now, since that, he's walked that statement back, but it's interesting from my perspective, I see the exact opposite. If I was to tell someone to go into a field, I'd say, go where the most technology is. Go where this is going to hit the field soonest, because then you'll be early in the adoption of these kind of technologies. I see this as it's going to be man plus AI versus man without AI. I don't see the AI versus human kind of play.
That's great. Or woman plus AI.
Sorry about
that. That's okay.
Broad.
No, I got it. I got it.
Sense.
So, Sue, the only thing I would add to that is the way we traditionally have trained primary care doctors, subspecialists, different areas, different disciplines, that's been true for a very long time. And it's really a very organ or disease-specific discipline, and that's what we do. And you know, one of the things that people are talking about is once this comes about, once we have a very broad and perhaps different understanding of diseases and disease pathways, we may actually be thinking about training a whole different cohort of specialists, because I don't know what this is going to look like in 5 years. So some of the very traditional disciplines, how we all trained, that may not be the way that medicine or diseases are approached in 5 or 10 or 20 years.
Very true.
So I think it's just something to keep in mind. I think that may well change, and we and those of us who are involved in medical student education and the larger group, we need to be thinking about how we're training people and for what with that in mind.
And Calum, you had something.
Yeah, and this is I think, where the convergence between all of the modern and emerging technologies and traditional medicine really, the rubber meets the road. The only constant in all of this change is the underlying biology, and that does not sit within silos that are defined by the healthcare system itself. It's very much crossing all sorts of different biological spaces, and we have to redesign everything we do to take into account those things.
Okay, I have some questions coming in from the audience. If you guys want to send some, I will try to leave a little bit of time for some of your questions. They're actually quite interesting. So we might ditch some of the stuff that I've got here. So, but I am going to ask this one, and this is, now there's some ominous warnings about AI. Very Elon Musk-like, right? And do they apply to healthcare? Can you give an example where, in fact, it's a concern to you of how it might be utilized? And I'm going to turn to you for this first answer.
So all change brings fear, and a lot that's been written out there, and you mentioned Musk, it's AI is fantastic, it will change the world, it will be transformative, or AI will bring extraordinarily intelligent machines, we will be destroyed. So, you have this spectrum, rather draconian spectrum of approaches here. And of course, I think neither one of them is particularly correct. So when you have these very large things that have the potential that this does, fear is going to be an obvious response. And as you say, I think we have to look back at history. I mean, this has been called the next industrial revolution. There's so much that's been said about looking way back in history at how when widespread sweeping changes occur, the fears are that it will ruin everything and jobs will go and people will never be the same. If we go to a more modern, if you will, application of this, I think it's really important to look at what we've learned from genetics and genomics. And when a lot of the initial power of what that meant came about, there were many, many people who voiced very considerable concerns about what that meant to be human, what that meant in terms of our knowledge. And I think a lot of those fears were, way over on one end of the spectrum, but a lot of them were very legitimate. But I think we have to look at where we are now compared to 10, 15, 20 years ago when a lot of this started happening, which is when you are confronting with something like this, which has such an ability to change everything, you put into place a structure, a discipline, guidelines. It is really up to all of us to look at what those structures are, what are the guidelines, what are the rules. There will be policies, some of it will be federal, some will be international. These things are happening very quickly. But I think the most important thing that people can do in our discipline, our collective discipline, is to really think about what those guidelines and rules may be, really to help govern this. So it's really the governance of these technologies that will make them most important and really help the most positive things come forward. And I think that is true in many aspects of genetics and genomics. The other thing, and this leads to a lot of the discussion, is a lot of the promissory note of genetics and genomics isn't really here quite yet. So if I look back 10 years or 15 years ago and I would say, well, what is the world going to look like based on how quickly this field is going in 10 or 15 years, it looks very different from where it looks now. It's getting there, but it's not really there. And I think with AI, that may be the same, that may not be the same, but I think the same type of discipline, governance, and intelligent implementation is what has to be done.
Totally agree. Tony?
So I do have some concerns, and I guess I would say they're not so much the Elon Musk vision of robot overlords, you know, enslaving us, but I think, although it does scare me because he's much smarter than I am, so if he's worried about that, maybe I should be. But what worries me is the potential, because the neural networks that are so much a part of machine learning are often hidden from view, to actually wind up codifying our inherent, sometimes unconscious biases. Totally. And so there was an article written in the New York Times recently by a woman at the MIT Media Lab who pointed out that a lot of the facial recognition software either didn't see her at all or couldn't recognize her face because she's black. And so, you know, if we start feeding all the data in, including genomic data, which obviously contains race and ethnicity information in it, there's the possibility that the neural networks could spit out a result saying people who look like this don't respond to a particular kind of therapy. And it actually could be just reinforcing a disparity of healthcare that relates to socioeconomic status or other biases in our system. So I think we have to be very thoughtful about how we are alert to those possibilities and put guardrails on the system so that doesn't happen. The hope is obviously that we use this to overcome disparities and improve the distribution of healthcare more widely. But I think the other is a possibility that we have to be very attentive to, just because in comparison to traditional statistical modeling, it's really hidden from view, as opposed to a model where you have all the terms are explicit and you notice what's going on.
Well, it's hard enough for us to manage our own unconscious bias, to manage that as you're developing algorithms. Right. I'm curious, I mean, Keith, you're so close to this. How do you start to think about that? And what are some of the things that you put into place to help avoid that?
Well, you know, the challenge is who regulates that, or who manages that? Or how do you expose that bias? First, there's no measure to indicate whether it is biased or how much. And really, our algorithms, as I say, can be created by anybody, so they don't necessarily have to live by any sort of guidelines per se. So I think, looking in the big picture forward, we're clearly missing regulatory requirements that are necessary to manage some of this. The second piece of this, I think, is also just general explicability. Why is this saying this? So, you know, I think of all the things that got automated over the years. For me, I at least knew how to do an algorithm by hand, you know, a logarithm, and then all of a sudden it's a button on my calculator. These are going to be things that never could have been done before. Yep. So I think there needs to be with it additional explanation of bias, explanation of the data set that this came from, explanations of the accuracy, of where it works, of where it doesn't work. When this number comes back, what does this mean? What's a 7 versus an 8 versus a 2? So, you know, my chair, Jim Brink, is the chair of the American Board of Radiology, and we realize this is hitting us quickly. And so at that governing, or that group, that college, we need to put some things in place like we did back in the days of imaging with DICOM, just to make sure things can communicate. Yep. This is a much higher level standard, but we need to do these same kind of things around these issues that could prevail.
Yeah, one of the questions that came in from an audience member is, what role, if any, could specialty board certification or maintenance of certification play in the adoption of AI for practicing physicians and the systems in which they work? So,
you know, so I would even ask a further question. So that means I would read that as, when the algorithms get created, how do you make sure that there's MOCs that demonstrates that you're capable of using those new algorithms? I would argue that, you know, again, for radiology, our question was, how do we keep up when MR comes out, or CT, or ultrasound, or all of these new things is a challenge. Now this is going to move an order of magnitude faster. But I would ask the question too, should we create a board for the algorithms? You know, how do we know that these algorithms are competent if they just get passed by the FDA to say that they're safe and effective? How do they compete? How do they challenge? If there's 100 algorithms, which one do I pick? How do I integrate? How do I switch? What happens if I switch? Yep. So there's a much broader question, I think, on that as well.
Oof. All right, another question that came in from the audience is, what is the role of medical device companies in advancing AI? Will every device come packaged with an algorithm? Calum?
I think most devices already do come packaged with fairly sophisticated algorithms. I think you can imagine lots of ways in which devices might impact, or already are impacting, care, both as sensors and delivery mechanisms for care, as well as distributed storage and computational platforms. And I think, actually, to be 100% honest, all of these are already present in most conventional implantable devices, at least in cardiology. And you can imagine how those might end up being platforms for much broader implementation of different technologies, whether on the sensor or the delivery side.
But I would posit that you cannot have medical devices that do not have smart systems on them going forward, because it's just an expectation now, and iPhones have made it so, right? So anything that we physically wear or hold, we will expect some knowledge to come out of it. So it's just an assumption.
But I would say, as we expand that Internet of Things and, to all of our biomedical devices, I do think there's an obligation on the device manufacturer's part as well, is to work with us on the security implications of that. And in particular, it's the algorithm, it's the hardware, it's the software, and it's really patching up all those vulnerabilities. And so I think it's just important to say that that's going to be an expectation that we all have to have of each other as we move forward.
Agree.
The other thing I was going to say was, we're used to software upgrades that happen much faster than hardware upgrades for devices and going through regulatory processes to get those approved. But I'm not sure that the FDA is ready for self-learning devices. Software that can update itself continuously and actually update itself differently at this location than at this location or this location. And so those are the challenges that we have in front of us, again, from managing all of these algorithms that are going to be included into but separate from the upgrades of the devices.
Yeah, I suspect we'll learn a lot from autonomy and Tesla going through the kind of issues that they're going through, because they do continually update their systems, consider it a device, right? And they are constantly making interpretations for us, or to be making, as we really get autonomy in place. So my suspicion is, particularly as the Transportation Board is looking at what just happened in Phoenix and Tampa, Florida, they're really going to be things to learn there for other regulatory bodies.
Well, so I have the honor of interviewing Jensen, the CEO of NVIDIA, tomorrow here. And the question I want to ask him, because I know this is the case, is that you cannot put a car out without 3 systems at once, and they take a rule to see which one wins 2 out of 3. And all that gets recorded continuously, and you pull all that data back. There's no discussion about that in healthcare right now. So I completely agree. Automotive is ahead of us. We need to learn from these things.
I think there are even, I know through One Brave Idea, we're actually working with at least 2 car companies on using some of the data they collect as actually ambient healthcare information. So I think those fields are going to converge, in fact, are already converging at a rate that perhaps we don't fully realize.
Yes, the stressors, for example, right?
Exactly.
That you're collecting for heart disease. All right, so here's another question that came in, and then I'll switch back to some of the others. But it says, how about trust? In a few years, less people will understand how complex AI works. Is an algorithm better? Is 60% good? How will we know? Is it 90% correct? Help. I added the help part because the question was pretty comprehensive.
I think these are, I'm curious what the other folks say, but these are my questions. And so I see, an algorithm gets created that can detect melanoma. And so now that is available on your smartphone and it's given to you at home. It's going to come back with a number, 20, 80, 40. What do you do next? And so this is not just changing what it is that clinicians in their current practice do. It's changing healthcare so much that we really need to rethink not just the numbers, but just how do we deliver care? How do we pull data back, analyze that, make sure that those numbers are correct, and that they actually have some value and meaning. A lot of the ways that we put AI in place today is we take existing clinical pathways and just inject it into the pathway. Now we're talking about changing into brand new paradigms of clinical pathways. And that's where it gets scary as to what we need to do.
And continual learning, and then post-market continual learning to feed back in. It's going to be interesting. Tony, I'm sorry.
I think the level of trust that's necessary is obviously going to depend on the context. So if you're debating whether to put an ICD in someone who might be at risk for cardiac arrest, the level of certainty that you may accept is going to vary dramatically, whether you're talking about identifying people who are at high risk that might benefit, or identify people at such low risk that you don't think they need a device. So the negative and positive predictive value is very different. But I mean, several people have made the analogy to genetics in the early days, and it strikes me that early on, there were a lot of genetic association studies that didn't replicate, lots of false positives and lots of a learning curve to figure out what should the standards be. And I feel like we're very much in that same phase, that we need to figure out, you know, what are the tests that these things, the hoops that they have to jump through as algorithms to be validated in some sense, and set some standards so that we can avoid that lack of reproducibility and have some vetting process so that we know which ones we really want to take forward to clinical application.
Very much so. Anne?
So I think one of the issues, and it's already been alluded to, is it's expectations versus or in addition to trust. So what you have here is probably a very unrealistic set of expectations based on what these things can do. And I mean, just to go back to the car analogy for one more time, accidents happen all the time. There are a lot of them. If there is an accident that involves something that is driven by AI, that for many people is seen as the end of the story because look at what's happened. So expectations are going to play into this in a very challenging way. What are our expectations in terms of diagnostic probability based on what people can do? What's our expectation around an algorithm? And also, I keep getting back to this, a lot of these algorithms are very segmented. So what are the expectations when multiple algorithms are going to be put together toward a common clinical challenge? And that also gets to Keith's point. There are going to be, and there will continue to be, so many algorithms. So which do you pick, even among a group that's clustered in one area, to then merge with those in another area that are going to move the field forward. So I think our expectations are right now, at least for many people, if you're going to be doing this, the assumption is it's going to be 100% accurate and it's going to replace everything else. And I'm not sure that's realistic, ever.
True. Calum?
I was just going to say that I think part of the key here is the implementation component. It's what you actually deliver. If you compare, let's say, the optimal AI algorithm with the traditional intelligence algorithm, which is implementing a guideline, the success rates there are probably less than 60% nationwide. There's a 12 to 15 year implementation cycle from something hitting the guidelines to being uniformly adopted across the country. So the bar is not very high. We just have to make sure that we're improving on what already exists. And I think once we start to recognize that even in the best systems, the current level of implementation is woefully inadequate, we will realize that just having a system ends up being a unique advantage.
Yep.
And as you start to think about how you can actually improve on that iteratively, I do think you start to see how AI might impact in a very real way clinical care in a very short space of time.
All right, one more audience question, and then we're going to go to our lightning round. So, will AI increase or reduce the cost of healthcare? And you sort of touched on it when we were in conversation. Who wants to take it first? Gregg.
So I'm going to get out of the financial mode here and talk about the other costs in healthcare. And on that front, I would say, yes, I have great hope that AI can reduce some of those costs. What are those costs? Those are the costs to our patients of trial and error medicine. Yep. Those are the costs to our population health management program, which really can't integrate social determinants and all the other variables that we'd like to put into decision making that we can't right now. With artificial intelligence, maybe we can. Those are the costs that are associated with trying to make sure that we're making great decisions for our patients, feeling overwhelmed by our electronic health records, by the move forward in scientific data and all the rest, and helping our physicians with really kind of getting the joy and meaning back in their work. I actually see these new tools and algorithms as enabling some of that as opposed to taking away from it.
That's good to hear. Can I just take a quick survey in the audience? How many think it's going to increase cost of care, AI? About 15 people. How many feel like it's going to decrease cost of care?
I'll vote.
About 20 people. No, I'm kidding. There's a lot more. There's a lot more. Okay, that's good to hear.
But
please.
I would say, it has been mentioned many times, this is a tool.
Right.
So you can make this tool do a lot of things. And you set a goal for this tool. I think the prevailing winds in healthcare in general are to reduce costs. So any new tool is going to be looked at as a savior to try and reduce costs. I think that's why it will.
And the only thing I would add on to this, and Gregg's already mentioned trial and error medicine, which is both bad for patients as well as expensive, is the incredible cost of tests. The incredible cost of tests of all sorts and how they are often ordered and what relevance or lack of relevance it has to that patient at that time. I mean, that I think is an enormous cost-saving opportunity and a good quality medical outcome as well.
All right, so in the remaining few minutes that we've got, we're just going to go around and you get to answer this quickly. All right, due to AI, name one new skill you think will be a must-have for clinicians in your field in the next 10 years. Tony?
So I think it's the same skill, which is critical thinking, but critical thinking informed by some understanding of what this means and some literacy with AI, machine learning, some of these tools so that you can engage and thoughtfully understand how to use it best.
I think I'm as much a fan of this as anybody, but I have an answer that may sound like one that comes from a Luddite. And that is, I think the most important skill that people are going to need is to be able to have that human touch, to be able to connect with patients, to be able to actually manage those things that only a human can do, to do well when a human is aided by a machine, and be able to be a great partner when the machine is aided by a human. Frankly, those things that we're going to lose because they're going to be taken over completely by machines, they don't add joy and meaning to clinicians' lives, and they really aren't adding a lot to the doctor-patient relationship. But being great at the doctor-patient relationship, that will always last.
Hooray. Yeah. Callum.
Given what Gregg and Tony have said, I would just add just-in-time learning, the ability to take information that you literally are having surfaced immediately in front of you to impact clinical care.
This has already been alluded to, but there are certain skills that a number of years ago sort of were, this is a new thing that doctors have to learn. They have to learn biostatistics. They have to understand data. And I think there are a lot of things related to AI that it's almost a fundamental core curriculum that physicians are really going to need to know. And the reason for that is they need to know what to trust and what not to trust and to really understand what it is they're being asked to do. And I think without those capabilities, you either are going to trust everything or deny everything, and it needs to be somewhere in between.
Great. Keith?
Yeah, I completely agree. Anne stole my answer. It was, I see it as...
I feel honored.
And I think data science is going to get a level of value in healthcare that is going to be a discipline. That all of these interesting questions that have been asked are probably going to be answered over the next 10 years in large part. And people are going to have a way to learn that through their training and not after the fact. And to be able to, as an example, I made the misfortune of not getting on Facebook for the first 7 or 8 years that it was out. And I thought, okay, I'll just hop on it. It's like flying a jet. I have to figure out exactly all the details and how do I communicate with this and that. I think it just onus is upon us all to make sure that we stay on top of all this technology as it comes out. It's just our job now.
Dude, from Atari
what can I
to
say?
Facebook?
I needed a break.
All right, well, we are actually out of time. Please join me in thanking our panelists for this discussion.